bump that gain up a little bit, Tristan. That's good. Thank you. Howdy, y'all. How's it going? Well, I'm not George. Can't tell. He's our teacher, right? Yeah? Okay, well, he is in the hospital as of right now, if you haven't seen the email already. Got some oxygen problems going on, so they're going to try to figure out what's going on with George. I know Melanie's taking good care of him, so we'll see how he's doing a little bit later on. I'm told that you guys are in Genesis, is that right? That wasn't the case, and I would have prepped for nothing all afternoon. So we're in 48? Yes? Close enough? All right. Well, I'll be honest with you, jumping into a text like this is not the easiest thing in the world because I don't know what George has been teaching you guys, but I know the text well enough to be able to go through it with you. And so who can tell me what happened in the previous class? What did you guys cover? Come on, Randy. All right. Probably a famine too last time, right? Hopefully. Yeah, kind of a good thing to be prepared for, you know. So in chapter 48, if we look in Genesis, again, I'm reading from the ESV. If you got something different, that's okay. I prefer the ESV, especially in the New Testament, for a lot of things. For the Greek, it matches the Septuagint in the Old Testament pretty well. You know what the Septuagint is? Top of your head? The Septuagint. Fun word to say. What's that? Yep. So it was a Koine Greek translation of the Hebrew and Aramaic for a little bit of it. And that was done by about 70 people. There's a whole bunch of legends that go along with the 70 translators. I mean, one of the funny ones, or one of the interesting ones that to me is a little bit funny is, you know, you have this king that hired these 70 translators to translate the Hebrew Bible into Koine Greek, and they locked them into a tower. And we had two different people, two different translators working. You can't hear me? Is that right? All right. More gain, I guess. Well, how about I just do this? This is a heavy thing. Is that better? Is that better? The mic's definitely on. It's pretty high. Is that better? Okay. I'll talk louder for you. So the Septuagint is the Hebrew Bible translated into Koine or Common Greek of the first century. It was done in the 3rd century BC, so 300 years before Christ. But one of the legends that goes along with it, they locked these two groups, these two individuals in towers, and they were to translate from Hebrew and Aramaic, the Hebrew Bible, into Greek. And when they both independently did that, they got it word for word, which if you know translation, that's not possible. They get these two different people from different backgrounds, different educational levels, different languages they speak originally, and to get the exact word for word, letter for letter translation is impossible. So the legends around the Septuagint are pretty interesting to read about. So anyway, I said all of that to say I use the ESV because it lines up with the Greek from the Septuagint quite well. And so, again, if it's different than what you've got, that's okay. Just be aware of it. So, Genesis 48, and we're looking here at towards the end of Genesis, right? There's 50 chapters, last time I checked. And so we're getting towards the tail end of it. Who is the author of Genesis? Okay. Who's the accepted author, possibly, of the book of Genesis? Moses, right? It's the 5 books of Moses, right? You have the Torah, you might say. And yeah, it's called the books of Moses, and there's some debate about who the actual author is. But if we just assume that it's Moses, then he's writing about the people that definitely came before him, right? You get to Exodus chapter 1, for example, and they fast forward a couple years, more than a couple, to talk about how this little family from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Israel, and then their 12 sons, 11 plus 2, or 10 plus 2, and they all become a great nation. And then the generation passes away that knew Joseph and all that he did, and then they become slaves. And that's the whole redemption process of Exodus, right? And so towards the end here, you've got Jacob in chapter 48 as my subtitle here. Jacob blesses Ephraim and Manasseh. So who are Ephraim and Manasseh? Two sons of Joseph, right? You have the firstborn, which is whom? Okay, and the secondborn, Ephraim. That's going to be pretty important for the next couple of passages that we read together, okay? All right, so let's begin reading here in Genesis chapter 48. After this, which is the continuation from 47, obviously, Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is ill." So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So you have the first and secondborn. In this culture, the firstborn son had some privileges that went along with being the firstborn son. Do you know what they are? This can be as broad as you want. Okay, double portion of the estate. That's definitely true in the first century, but definitely would have had some patriarchal tones in the Old Testament as well. What else? All right, so usually the blessing of the father goes to the firstborn son, which is interesting because who's the person we're talking about here in this text? Jacob. Why would that be interesting that he is referring? Right. Yeah, he tricked his old blind dad, right, Isaac, to be able to get the blessing on Jacob instead of his brother, who was named who? Esau, right? So that was a pretty big ordeal and kind of paints Jacob, or later called Israel, he who strives with God, in kind of a negative light, right? So he's not my favorite Bible character, but he is good in the sense that you know that he's a man of God. He's got God's blessing, but he didn't get there in the complete honest way. So Jacob is now being talked about. Verse 2, "And it was told to Jacob, your son Joseph has come to you. And then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed." So we kind of get a picture here of where he's at physically, in the sense that he has to struggle to get up out of bed and put his feet on the ground, right? I mean, that's definitely a thing to kind of pick up here on the text, is really how frail he is. I mean, he's definitely not a young man anymore, and he's not doing well. Verse 3, "Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession." So again, who is speaking to Jacob that he's recalling here in verses 3 and 4? God is, right? I'm just making sure this is softball questions that kind of gets warmed up a little bit, okay? So yeah, he's saying, I want to remind you of the promises that were given to me by God of, yeah, I'm going to multiply you, give you a company of peoples. I'll give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. So where did that promise come from? Abraham, yeah. So the Abrahamic promise here in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, when he was told to leave his people and his father's house and go to a land that he'd be shown to afterwards, that was 3 generations ago, and back then generations were a bit longer than they are nowadays. And so we've got the kind of tracing of the promise, right? There's one thing that's not mentioned in here, in verses 3 and 4, that was a part of the Abrahamic blessing that he did not tell in verses 3 and 4. Can you guess what it might be? Yeah, so through him would all nations be blessed. And what is that a reference to? The Messiah, right? So ultimately, not just the Jews, they're not quite called that yet historically, the Hebrews, wouldn't have really known what that means until later on, when they would have the Holy Spirit to inform them, oh, that was the Abrahamic promise of bringing the Messiah. Okay, verse 5, "And now your 2 sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are." So what's he doing there? Yeah, so he's saying here that my grandkids are like my children. He's basically including them into that promise, which is nice because that kind of shows us that Jacob or Israel at this point is passing down that promise to the rightful heirs, which would be Joseph's lineage as well. Now, it always kind of threw me for a loop when I go through and talk about all the tribes of Israel, and there was no Jacob, right? There's no tribe of Jacob that has a land possession in Joshua, for example. So you have Ephraim and Manasseh being kind of adopted as like a father, like a son rather, to Jacob. So I already kind of gave it away, but what's the name Israel mean? Israel? That L at the end is pretty easy, I think. So El is God, Elohim, right, is Lord God. But so Israel was given to Jacob as a new name after what event? He wrestled with, might be an angel of God, right, or messenger of God. But he wrestled with God, and God pulled a dirty trick and popped his hip out of joint to kind of teach him a lesson, right? And he changed his name from Jacob, which can mean skillful or crafty, which is a good name for him, and then change it to he who strives with God, so kind of fighting him along the way. So just kind of a small note there for you. Verse 6, and the children that you have fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. So if he had any more kids, they would be subordinate to Manasseh and Ephraim, according to the promise here. And let's see, verse 7. As for me, when I came from Paddan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is in Bethlehem. So where was Rachel buried? Bethlehem, right? Or Bethlehem, so the house of that area. So anyway, interesting for a couple of reasons. You wouldn't know it quite yet if you were a Hebrew reading this, but why is that significant to us? Yeah, you've got Jesus, right? Coming out of that same kind of area. All right. Verse 8. When Israel saw Joseph's son, he said, who are these? So it's this kind of a formal situation that's going on here. We don't really, I don't think, to my knowledge, have this anymore. When you're about to leave this world, do you call your children and grandchildren to your side to pass on a blessing to them in the kind of religious rite? I don't know. I haven't seen it done before, but this was kind of a huge ritual, you might say, to kind of pass on the promises and the blessings that you were given down to your children and grandchildren. Verse 9, Joseph said to his father, these are my sons, whom God has given me here. And he said, bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. So again, you can kind of just imagine the situation is so interesting when you know the origin of Jacob and how his father loved Esau because he was a hunter and could make good food. And then Jacob was loved most by his mother, and she kind of finagled her way to get that blessing on her favorite son, right? Verse 10, now the eyes of Israel, or Jacob, were dim with age, so that he could not see. What's that mean? He had cataracts, absolutely. That's a scriptural term for it. He couldn't see that well, right? As obviously his father, Isaac, couldn't back in the day. So if you see the parallelism going on here, the story of Jacob blessing his grandkids as though they were his children is so parallel to what Isaac did for Esau and Jacob, just with no deception going on, which is a bit refreshing scripturally. Let's see here. So Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your offspring also. What's that all about? Yeah. So his brothers were less than honest about what took place. They had a little bit of envy going on, right? And they pretended like he was torn up by some wild animal and brought back the multicolored cloak, the technicolor coat, you might say, covered in what kind of blood? Was it sheep's blood? Lamb's blood? Sheep's? What was it? Critter blood. Okay, I was going to say, I don't know what that word is, but critter, I know that word. So he was deceived, and he was in mourning for Joseph for a long time before he realized that he wasn't dead. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then think about Abraham and Sarah, though, right? I mean, there are some theories as to why people were so fertile and so able to advance in age back then compared to where we are now. We don't have a verse for it, but it's just an interesting thought that this is not that far timeline-wise after the flood, right? And so when it comes to the aging process, how much the sun has to do with aging and the metabolism, those that lived before the flood lived a long time, a very long time. Methuselah, for example, kind of an old guy towards the end, right? And so that's one theory as to why folks live so long. Just a natural explanation would be that if they had no UV exposure their entire lives, you don't wrinkle up that much. So anyway, he's still old. Let's see. Verse 12, then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to his earth. So where were they previously? Sitting on his knees, right? You see me over there on Sundays, hopefully not too much, yanking that boy out to be told you need to sit down and be quiet and not wiggle too much and be nice and all that kind of stuff. But he's on my knees and on my lap to be able to control that little 3-year-old, or almost 3-year-old. And he bows himself down with his face to the earth. Joseph, verse 13, took them both, Ephraim in his right hand towards Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand towards Israel's right hand, and he brought them near him. So just kind of passing on the grandchildren to the grandfather. Verse 14, and Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands because Manasseh was the firstborn. And so you've got Ephraim and Manasseh, and then you would expect their hands to just go over top of the oldest first, but instead he crosses his hands and mixes it all up, which would have been peculiar and unusual to do, right? Obviously, the parallel of what happened with Esau and Jacob with Isaac kind of comes to mind. He wanted to reach out his hand and bless Esau as his firstborn, but instead he kind of got to Jacob first, right? So interesting kind of parallel. And he blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel or messenger who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on. In the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude into the midst of the earth. So the first blessing is for Joseph, but towards the children. And what's the blessing? Just to kind of recap so far. Yeah. Here's the promise that was given to me. I'm passing it on to you, right? So you continue this course that God has given me. It's interesting here that you've got a little bit of insight from Jacob about how he thought about God, because we've not seen the relationship between Jacob or Israel and God really at all after the wrestling with the angel thing took place. It's always interesting to me to see where someone starts and then what the motivating events were that took place in their life, and then to kind of see where they ended up. So, for example, Abraham's probably my favorite, because when you get to Genesis 12, 1 through 3, that's not the moment where God told him to go to the wilderness, away from his father's house. That was after the fact. He had left Haran and went to the Ur of Chaldees, right? So while he was there, kind of biding his time, still at his father's house, Then God told him, hey, I told you to go out here to a land that I will give to you and your offspring, and you'll multiply and bless all nations. So that was him kind of being kicked by God to go and do what he was told to do. And so when you see that, and then he gets to a big city, he's got a beautiful wife, and he gets a little afraid, right, of the king. So what's he do with Sarah? Yeah, just lie for me, just so I don't get killed along the way and you get taken as a concubine. Just lie and say that you're my sister. And it wasn't too far from the truth, to be honest with you. Yeah, but still, it was enough lie that God was like, nah, that's not how we're going to do this. Fast forward from all of Abraham's struggles in life, all those moments that shaped him and molded him into being the person God wanted him to be. And at the very end of the story, he's told by God to go up to a mountain and go kill his son, the one he's been waiting for all these years. And what's Abraham do? Next morning, woke up early in the morning, which indicates his imperative need, and went to go do what God told him to do. Did it make sense? No, didn't make any sense. But he had learned through the process of all that development to trust God no matter what, which is a huge lesson, obviously, for all of us. So to see Jacob go from who he was, and then to see him talk about God as the shepherd of his life is a huge dynamic. He's the one saying, I'm the sheep, and the Lord is my shepherd, and he is the one that's leading me to where I'm supposed to be. And thus far, it's worked out pretty well. I mean, if Joseph wasn't where he was when he needed to be there throughout all his struggle, then they would have died in the famine, right? So definitely an interesting thought. Any questions or comments about that? Okay, moving on. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. As he would, you got a guy who can't really see, right? You think he just messed it up somehow. He tries to pull his hand away and to move it to the firstborn son. That's not what Jacob was trying to do. Verse 18, Joseph said to his father, not this way, my father, since this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. So I don't know about you, but when I read texts like this, where you see a family dynamic in this kind of play, I can imagine what that must be like in my current generation. I just imagine, personally, Jacob here in a hospital bed, got all his strength mustered to be able to sit up in this bed and kick his feet over. He's got his grandkids on his lap, and he messed up, it seems, where he put his hands. And you have the son now trying to move his hand forcibly to put it on the right child's head. He says, no, that's not what I'm trying to do here. So definitely an interesting way to kind of do this narrative, the story. But his father refused. I know, my son, I know. He shall become a people, and he shall also be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. Is that true? Easy answer is yeah, because God said so. Yeah. The longer answer is if you actually track what these children became, he's absolutely right. He nailed it. This is the point where we start to have the question in our minds, is this just Jacob or Israel as an older, experienced man, patriarch of the family, making some predictions about what's going on, or is he now being influenced by God himself? Because this is going to get real specific in a little bit, right? What are your thoughts about that? I agree. This is the first little bit of the narrative or the story where we see, okay, it's not just Jacob talking here. There's something else going on. Because how would Jacob know, as an old guy who can't see, what these children would become? And that would be a remarkable skill to have nowadays. If you just have a child and say, well, I know what he's going to do and how great he's going to be, or I know how great she's going to be, or there's going to be some trouble for this guy in the future, or whatever. That'd be a great skill to have, but Jacob didn't really have that, right, as far as we know. So we see the influence here of the Holy Spirit, or God, acting through him a little bit. And that will definitely, in verse 49, come to fruition for us. Okay. Let's see. Verse 20. So he blessed them that day, saying, By you Israel will pronounce blessings, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. What's the ironic twist in all that? It's exactly parallel to what happened to him and his brother. It wasn't necessarily God doing it, you might say. It was more of the insistence of the mother in some verses. But we definitely see Jacob being a bit headstrong and forcing his way to the front. And here he's saying the same thing's going to happen to your children, Joseph, that happened to us. Just that's how it's going to be. Okay, verse 21, Then Israel said to Joseph, Behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again into the land of your fathers. So what's the land of the fathers? Canaan, yeah. It's an encompassing word. Specifically, yeah, we would call it Canaan, but yeah, you're not going to stay here forever, is the idea. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. So he got an inheritance, right? Because not all of your brothers are going to have a land plot, but I've got a slope of a mountain range that I've conquered just for you, and it's waiting for you. Would Joseph ever see that land? No, he wouldn't have, not in the flesh. It was interesting how comforting it would have been if you're Joseph and you've gone through what you've gone through. If you know the life of Joseph, you know it was not a little ordeal he went through to get to where he was today, or in this text. But to be told by your father that you've got a place waiting for you is comforting. Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things where you look at it and you say, well, there's no logical way for Jacob to have known that unless God revealed it to him, right? This is still the patriarchal period before Exodus starts, right? And so you've got this connection between God and the patriarchs, which is an interesting dynamic. I've got a whole lot of questions about what that was like, because really what you see from Job especially is Job had a very strong relationship with God, but you don't really see God communicating to him directly really at all until the very end. And so I wonder if that was just passed down in this kind of way from grandfather to son to grandson to great-grandson of this is who God is, this is what he wants from us, and so on, or if it was more of a direct way in the case of God speaking through certain people. So, interesting time. It is in a way. I think, again, like Job is probably the best insight we have to someone who's not connected to the Abrahamic story. And he would offer daily sacrifices for himself and his family, his children, who were all grown and had their own children as well. And so what God required sacrifice-wise was much more specific. And it's interesting to kind of see that change with this covenant through Moses a little bit later on. Okay, here's the real good stuff. Chapter 49, verse 1. Then Jacob called his sons, who are they? All of them, right? Okay. And said, Gather yourselves together that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come. Now there's the real kicker for me. That gives us the information we needed about whether or not he was influenced by God or not. These predictions are going to be spot on, just to kind of give you the spoiler alert first. There's no way he could have called it like he did unless God had revealed it to him in some kind of way. We don't have, again, the text that tells us God told Jacob all these things were going to come to pass, but how else would he know, for example, that through Judah you would have a king, which is talking about Christ, right? Okay, verse 2, assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob, listen to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. What's that mean? How would you rephrase that? Yeah, as the firstborn should be, right? Right, Esau? After all these years, he's saying, yeah, you're my firstborn son. All the honor and preeminence goes before you. What's preeminent mean, by the way? Preeminence. First. What's that? Yeah. If you go to the book of Hebrews, for example, it talks about how Christ is the most preeminent one before Moses, before Abraham, before the angels. The whole point of Hebrews is the author is trying to convey Christ is the best. He is better than all the other ones. So he's trying to say here, again in our language, in verse 3, Reuben, you are supposed to be the best one. Right? You're my firstborn. Got all my attention, got all my strength, got all my might. And then verse 4, unstable as water. How stable is water? You don't want to stand on it too long, right? It's too deep. You shall not have preeminence. Well, talk about an ego and then a deflated ego. He goes, you were set up to be the best one that I had. You had my attention, you had my strength. Instead, you will not have the preeminence because you went up to your father's bed and you defiled it. He went up to my couch. What's it all about? Yeah, not a great thing. So back in the day, right, back in the patriarchal period especially, even some Mosaic, you've got very little restriction when it comes to how many wives to have, right? I think the tone originally was set by God by making Adam and then making Eve. And then it was good, right? You got one man, one woman for life. That was the ideal condition. Mankind, in their great wisdom, becoming like God from eating from the tree, decided to make their own decisions, and that didn't work out well. So you've got Reuben here, verse 3 and 4, being cursed is not the right word, but given the information that because of his actions he was not going to be the preeminent or the best one of his sons, is interesting. Okay, thoughts or questions about that? Yeah, absolutely. If there's any doubt about consequences from sin being multi-generational, not the guilt of the sin, but the consequences of the sin. Ask anyone who grew up in a house where your dad was an alcoholic or a drug addict. Did that affect you at all? If you had that condition? Probably. If you continue that lifestyle, will it affect your children? Absolutely. And so that's just one example that we can hopefully not relate to too much, but a lot of folks can, unfortunately. So, verse 5, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. So what were they known for? By Jacob, or by God for that matter. Yeah, they killed a town, so that's probably not great, right? But if you got a job that needs to be done, that's dirty work, who are you going to call? Simeon and Levi, apparently back in the day. Let my soul come not into their counsel, O my glory. Be not joined to their company, because in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Well, if you hamstring an oxen, what's that do? Yeah, you can't do anything. What good is an oxen that can't walk? If you can't plow your field. Yeah, if you just walk over and hamstring an animal, then they will die a slowful, painful death. And they decided to do that. Verse 7, cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, because it's cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So we got a little preview here. Who is the author again, probably? Well, God, but human author, maybe Moses, right? Pretty strong evidence for it, at the very least. And so you've got Moses talking about this from God's inspiration, saying a little bit of preview. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. What's that mean? It's subtle. A little bit. A little bit. It's interesting how we've already got a preview of this great land of Canaan called Israel at one point. You'd have Judah and you'd have Israel, right? So now you've got the kind of Hebrew language here introducing that concept to us of Jacob and Israel. So in Hebrew, the parallelism, saying something one way, one direction, and then following up immediately with saying the exact same thing with a little bit different language, that's classic Hebrew parallelism. So you're trying to emphasize a point. Go to Proverbs or Psalms, it happens all the time. They'll say one thing one way, then immediately we have a comma, and then the exact same thing is said with different words to emphasize this is what we're talking about. So he's saying here, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel, means the same thing. I will divide, I will scatter. I will divide them in Jacob, scatter them in Israel. So again, that's that kind of forceful Hebrew parallelism that shows us he knew what he was talking about. Mm-hmm. That's right. Didn't have any good kings, right? Not a single one in the northern tribes. You got 3, maybe 4, if you count them right, in Judah. They weren't that great, to be honest. Okay. Judah, so moving on from Simeon and Levi and Reuben now. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. That's pretty good, right? It's a good blessing, a good kind of preview of what's to come for your family lineage. What's significant about the land that Judah would occupy in the book of Joshua? The tribe of Judah had a land plot that they would claim for themselves, or God would give them through Joshua. Why was it significant? Yeah, that's the one. So Jerusalem was a part of the Judah land territory, which would be pivotal, especially when you got the divided kingdom and you have the Assyrians and Babylonians. That would be pretty important. And then, verse 9, Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched down as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? What's that mean? How would you rephrase that? I do that to pause and slow down, because if you just read it like, yep, sounds good, he's a lion cub, but what's it mean? Any guesses? Tell you if you're right or wrong. Let's read it again. Judah is a lion's cub, so if he's a lion's cub, one day he might be what? A lion. Okay, so far so good. From the prey, you have gone up. What's that mean? So far, things are going well from you. You don't have any major enemies. He stooped down, he crouched down as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? So he's currently at peace, but don't forget, it's still a lion, right? If you got a sleeping lion, you can walk over and poke him once or twice, but guess what? He's still a lion. So that's the kind of the idea here is right now you're at peace, and you don't want to be on his bad side or be an enemy of Judah. And not just the individual, obviously, talking about his lineage is the idea. And then verse 10. The scepter, what's a scepter? Right, so back in the day you had kings, right? I always imagine, I don't know why, a lion in a robe that's purple. He's got little spots around the collar, right? He's got a crown on his head. And he's got this little stick, usually made of gold, got some stuff in it, diamonds, rubies, whatever. And that little thing indicates what? Power. He's the king, right? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff. So again, there's that parallelism. So you have a scepter, ruler staff, same thing, different word for it, different phrase for it. From between his feet. What does that indicate? Okay. The scepter or the ruler's staff shall not depart from between his feet. It's a very polite way to say it in the Hebrew. So usually the Bible, especially in English, when they talk about things that you don't want to talk about with kids present, you use the phrase feet. Right? If someone covers their feet, what's going on? It's important to know because it really enhances some stories for us. If I were to use the restroom, for example, I'd have to go to the restroom. I'd have to cover my feet with my pants. Okay? All with me? Yeah. Okay? So when Saul went into the cave when he was trying to find David and he was covering his feet, what was he doing? Using the bathroom. Okay? It was very polite in the English because, in the King James, you can't just say use the bathroom. So you have to say cover your feet. Another story that involves that, which took me way too long to realize, was Ruth. Right? You've read Ruth before, hopefully? Once or twice? Ruth uncovered his feet when he was sleeping. Now, with me? Or do I have to get more graphic? Okay, yeah. So when you cover your feet using the bathroom, uncover your feet, pants aren't down, they're pulled up. And so, okay. Here we are back in the text, kind of recap. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Talking about the children that he would father from that point forward. So his genealogy. Very polite way to say it. But from that which would come from his loins, his children, his grandchildren, there's going to be a ruler somewhere in there, right, is the idea. Until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Interesting. So who is the first king of Israel? Saul. What tribe was he from? Nope. Benjamin, the little one, the little guy, right? The young guy. That's why he was so humble at first, because he's like, I'm not from anybody. Like, what's so important? But what about David, for example? What tribe was he from? Judah. So you have a little bit of prophetic utterance here, right? Which Jacob would have known if God didn't tell him what it was. So not only do we have the best king ever of Israel, David, who, again, was human and had faults and failures and so on, we've also got a small little echo of something else. Who else came from Judah later on? Yeah, if you go to Matthew, if you go to Luke, you've got it going back through Mary's bloodline through Luke, and then Joseph's bloodline through Matthew. So both things are covered. Although he wasn't his physical father, that would have been a problem if you're tracing genealogies if you don't talk about who the dad is, right? So even the supposed dad of Jesus, the Messiah, would have been thought of as Joseph back in the first century. So they trace them all back, and God covered that base quite well. So not only are we talking about probably David, in the immediate context, but also an echo later of this Messiah who would come through Judah, which was Jesus. Okay. Binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, that's the exact same thing, two different ways. I'll catch it already? I'm telling you, it's all the way throughout the Hebrew Bible. Every time you look at the Torah, you've got the same thing said two different ways to emphasize what's being said. One reason is to emphasize what's being said as being important. It's kind of like Jesus says, truly, truly, I say unto you, or if you have ears to hear, let him hear. At the end of a parable, he's like, you get it? It's pretty important stuff I just said about a fisherman going out there, casting a net, got all kinds of fish, right? You got ears to hear? Can he figure it out? So that's the idea. But also, it would be much easier to translate because you've got the same thing said twice. So if you know what one is, you know what the other one is. So just kind of a helpful thing from the Hebrew there for us. He has washed his garments in wine and his vesture in the blood of grapes. Again, same thing said two different ways. So what does it mean that he's going to bind his donkey to the choice vine? It's open to a little bit of interpretation. Maybe. Anybody else ride a donkey somewhere? Oh, interesting. It's a weird coincidence, right? Yeah, do you ride a donkey or a horse? or both? Depends what gospel account you're in. Yeah, could have been a colt, could have been a donkey, could have been a foal, who knows? But anyway, just some interesting connections there. Again, he has washed his garments in wine. What's that indicate? Do you wash your garments in wine traditionally? In a wash machine in your house, don't you? Interesting. That's it. But also, if you got wine, that means that you have a good vineyard. So you've got the resources to be able to have that. So, verse 12, his eyes are darker than wine, so they're dark, and his teeth are whiter than milk. Is having white teeth back in the day a good thing or a bad thing? Unusual thing. And when God says in a prophetic utterance, I will make your teeth whiter than snow, or have you'll have clean teeth, what does that indicate? You know this? Okay, so white teeth nowadays, probably a good thing, right? No one wants black teeth. It was. That's true, but if you have white teeth, prophetically, it means that you're going through a famine. Yeah, you don't have any food to eat, so you can't dirty your teeth. Yeah, if you don't have wine to stain your teeth, you don't have food to stain your teeth, that you're going through a famine. So interestingly here, your eyes are darker than wine, his teeth are whiter than milk. So a kind of small little preview of what's going to happen to Judah, especially if you go through the captivity period when they were being besieged. So, yeah, interesting little connection to make. Verse 13, moving on from Judah. Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall be at Sidon. That's quite specific, wouldn't you say? And where was Zebulun's land plot in the book of Joshua? I'll give you one good guess. By the coast. Yeah, interesting, right? Issachar is a strong donkey crouching between the sheepfolds. What's that mean? Hard-headed is a good one. He's strong, he's able, he's willing, but verse 15, he saw that a resting place was good and the land was pleasant, so he bowed his shoulder to bear and became a servant at forced labor. Interesting here because if you got a map in the back of your Bible of where the land plot was, they didn't cross Canaan. They saw the land was good enough on this side of the Jordan, didn't want to cross over. So if there's any kind of battles, you couldn't call him because he was not anywhere near you. Okay, let's see, verse 16, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heel so that his rider falls backwards. Good prophecy or bad prophecy? Ain't good, right? If you're walking down the path and you see a viper in the way, I couldn't tell you, top of my head. And then he gets so spun up by Dan, verse 18, he pauses here. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. Raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels, talking about their ongoing conflict with the Philistines back in our future in the day. Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall wear royal delicacies. Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. So Joseph is mentioned here by name. We're talking about him and his descendants, which would include whom? Yep, okay, his kids. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely, yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms remained agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. Who is that? Yeah, God. Okay. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. You might have in the English a capital S for shepherd there. The stone, it's another word for a stone. A rock. That's the word I was looking for, right? So, rock of Israel.
cornerstone, one might say. By the God of your Father, who will bless you, by the Almighty, who will bless you with blessings from heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. So let's pause there. All right. By the God of your Father, who will help you, by the Almighty, who will bless you with blessings of heaven above. How many heavens are there according to the Hebrew Scriptures? Close. One more than three. Four. Have I explained this before? I had once. All right, so you got 4 different heavens for the Hebrew, right? First one is where the birds fly, the sky literally above you. The second one is where you see the hosts of heaven, or the hosts of heaven. Sun, moon, stars, constellations, etc., thought to be angels by the Hebrews, by the way. Interesting thought there. So that's the heavens, right? So space, we'd call it. You have heaven where God is, right? Wherever that may be. Isaiah 7 paints a pretty wild picture for us of what that throne room looks like. And then you've got heaven that we think about. When I say heaven for the Christian, what do you think about? Pearly gates. Peter's there with a book or something, right? Piece of gold, yeah, all that kind of stuff. Well, one mansion, a lot of rooms. Whatever, right? It's a little joke. Not funny, but, you know. So anyway, so you have those 4 heavens we're talking about here. The eternal resting place of the soul, we might say. So in this particular case, verse 25, who will bless you with blessings of heaven above. Which heaven is that from the context? So who's the guy that's going to bless you? Big picture. God, right? God's going to bless you. He's going to do it from where he is. Right? So the picture here really is, let's see, by the God of your Father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with the blessings of heaven above, where he is, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath. What is that? Okay, some of the ocean. It's not a bad idea. It's the depths of the earth. So the way that the Jew would have thought about the earth would not be how we think about the earth today. We know if you go deep into the earth enough, past the crust, what do you hit? If you just start digging and digging and digging and digging, will you get to China? Well, you know, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. But no, you won't get to China. If you dig down deep enough, you'll get to the mantle of the earth, where your shovel might not do you much good with molten lava. Then you've got the core of the earth, right? But for the Hebrew, it wasn't that way. They thought about this being literally just a flat plane, because all they could see was a flat plane. So you've got God in the heavens above, and you've got those in the pit, or Sheol, or in the depths of the earth. So that's where your body was put. So, again, for the context here, who will bless you with the blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, right? Then blessings of the breast and of the womb, so multiplication of the earth, having a continuation of the legacy that Abraham began when he decided to leave the Ur of Chaldees. So he's saying the all-encompassing earth is going to be a blessing to you by God. That's all he's trying to say. Fancy way to say it. Verse 26, the blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessing of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who is set apart from his brothers. How was Joseph set apart by his brothers? He had a little dream, right? Right. He did. I think he had more than 2, but only 2 are recorded for us, right? And so you've got him literally being set apart from envy and jealousy or avarice by being sold in slavery. But also he was set apart because he was the one who allowed them to live through that great famine that God told him about through the king's dream. And then finally, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning devouring the prey, and in evening dividing the spoil. So what king came from him? From Benjamin? First king of Israel? Saul. Yeah. So it's interesting here because what you've got is not just a prediction or a blessing or a revelation of what these children would become, but what their offspring would become. And even that echoes forward to not just the kingdom of Israel with Saul and David and Solomon, for example, but also going towards the Messiah through Dan especially, or Judah rather especially. Okay, questions, comments? Not yet. They did for a good long while. The captivity definitely ended that whole. So we have the United States of America, last time I checked, right? We have independent states that are all combined under one federal government. And so if we were all as a country taken captive and taken to somewhere else, let's just pick on Canadians, for example, because they're never going to hurt us. If we were taken captive by Canada, we finally, after 70 years, got a chance to come back to our home country, the states might not work the way they did before. There might be a sense of centralized integrity and unity, right, more than we have now with our individual states. That definitely took place historically with the Jews. When they were taken captive and they came back, there was not that big of a deal talked about what tribe you were from, unless you were part of the priestly tribe, which they lost the records of that, so it's kind of hard to prove. Okay, moving on, verse 28. We're going to finish this chapter tonight. These are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each one with a blessing suitable to him. Verse 28 is a huge red flag, if you don't see it already. All of these are the 12 tribes of Israel. Were there currently tribes of Israel when this was being spoken? No, they weren't tribes yet. They were just kids. They were just children, right? So the author lived when these people became tribes, which is great because it's a small little peek behind the curtain of when was this written, not when this was spoken. So, small thing. Verse 29, then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. You can go back and read when that took place. You needed a place to put Sarah, right? Unfortunately. There they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife, and there I buried Leah. Anyway, moving on. Verse 32. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. I mean, talk about going out. That's one way to do it. What does it mean, quickly, to be gathered to his people? He died. Okay. One small thing, and then we'll close out for the night. For the Hebrew, the idea of an afterlife was debated, to say the least, up until the first century and even beyond. So to be gathered to your people literally meant to be gathered with the bones of your people. So you'd be placed into a box, put into a cave. A generation goes by, they put all those bones together in a smaller box, and they place them on top of the other bones that are there. That's literally gathered to your people in that sense. It does for us indicate an afterlife, but for them, more literally, it meant just gathered with the bones of your loved ones. Okay, that's all I got. Any final questions or comments? Hopefully you got some benefit from going through 49 with me. Hopefully George will be back here and healthy next week. If not, I'll be happy to continue for him if you guys want me. And that'll be it for us. All right? Thank you.